All right. Uh, we left off in verse 15, first kind of half of this chapter, and we'll pick it up in verse 16. So let me read the text for us. Genesis 18:16. Then the men set out from there, and they looked down toward Sodom. And Abraham went with them to set them on their way. Yahweh said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of Yahweh by doing righteousness and justice, so that Yahweh may bring to Abraham what he has promised him." Then Yahweh said, "Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know." So the men turned from there and went towards Sodom. But Abraham still stood before Yahweh. Then Abraham drew near and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" And Yahweh said, "If I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake." Abraham answered and said, "Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 50 of the 50, suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5?" And he said, "I will not destroy it if I find 45 there." Again he spoke to him and said, "Suppose 40 are found there." He answered, "For the sake of 40, I will not do it." Then he said, "Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there." He answered, "I will not do it if I find 30 there." He said, "Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there." He answered, "For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it." Then he said, "Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this once. Suppose 10 are found there." He answered, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." And Yahweh went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. Well, is God right? Is God right? This is a major theme, really, of the Bible, even the question of God's rightness in how he acts. The first book of the Bible, Job, I know you thought I was going to say Genesis, but the first written book is probably Job. And that's largely what makes up the book of Job is the question, is God right in what he does? And so we have Job's a particular instance of suffering and his reckoning with the righteousness of God there, and even his own need for righteousness that Job really wished for. Job had 3 wishes, if you think about it. He wished for a God-man mediator who would forgive his sins and raise him from the dead. It's like if you could only give, one of my professors said, if you could only give Job the book of Romans, he would have cried. Like it's like, wow, this is it. But that's largely the question: is God right? Is God right? And the Bible really uh, unfolds that question as it continues on. But Genesis 18, this is a very foundational book as well. Uh, and in a way, Genesis picks up where Job leaves off, the question of God's rightness, and gives more detail to where evil has come from. And here we see in Genesis 18, though, Abraham wrestling with this very question of God's rightness, of the righteousness and justice of God. And you really see this chapter breaking down into 2 sections. And of course, not only because we spent last week studying half of it, and this week studying the other half, but if you look at chapter 18, you'll find that there are 2 questions that are asked that both reveal the character of God. And that's what breaks the chapter into its two parts. You'll see that verse 14 of chapter 18, we looked last time, the question is asked, is anything too hard for Yahweh? Is anything too hard for Yahweh? And there's really the focal point of that first half of the chapter, God's power. It's revealing God's power, because here God comes and reveals his plan to Abraham and Sarah about this baby coming to Sarah about that time next year. And Sarah is just, flabbergasted at that thought, and she laughs. But here we have the focal point is, if God is who he is, then nothing is too hard for him. God is all powerful. And then in the second half of the chapter, we see another perfection of God brought to our attention by another question in verse 25. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And both of these questions imply an affirmative answer, right? They're not questions that say they're calling into question God's character, but really are a rhetorical way of affirming God's character. So is anything too hard for Yahweh? Of course not. That's the answer. And then, shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? Of course he will. Of course he will. He will. And so in this way, we see the focal point being on the character of God here and upon his perfections that are highlighted for us. So that's kind of where I've tried to draw our attention last week, looking at the power of God, this week in this study at the righteousness of God in the second part. And this comes, if we're zooming out a little bit, we see these three sections: first part of chapter 18, second part of chapter 18, and then all of 19, which really form this kind of mini story about the city of Sodom and Gomorrah and what is coming for that city, that wicked city. And so we're in this middle section where Abraham is praying, interceding on behalf of this wicked city. And we learn a number of lessons about intercession and prayer in this, but also about God's righteous character. So let's kind of break this down, and you can even see in your own Bible, in mine, there's indentations starting in verse 16, and that takes us to verse 21, and then 22, another indentation, and then another one in 27. And that's a good breakdown, I think, of the chapter as you take it in chunks here. So let's consider verses 16 to 21 a little bit more. And you could look at this in a number of ways, but I called it the privileged invitation to prayer. The privileged invitation to prayer. And we saw last time that there was these three persons that came to Abraham, and we notified that two were angels most likely, and one is Yahweh himself appearing to Abraham. And so it says in verse 16, then the men set out from there. So they appeared as men. Interestingly enough, the angels never appear as anything other than men, which is interesting. So, you might say, oh, you're my angel, to your wife or something. It's like, it's wrong. Theologically, but I don't know, maybe there are, but they just never appear that way. They're always appearing as men, interestingly enough. So our kids love to correct, Hallmark little baby cherubs and stuff, or things like that. Aren't angels always men? It's like, yes. Anyway, then the men set out from there, and they looked down towards the city of Sodom, down towards Sodom. So they're in an elevated spot, and they're looking down. Sodom and Gomorrah really, if you've been to Israel before, even if you haven't, you know that there's you have the Mediterranean Sea. Let me see, right here. Okay, so Mediterranean Sea is over here. Get it your perspective. And then you have Israel's here. And up here, you have the Sea of Galilee, and then running through is the Jordan River. And then you have the big Dead Sea right here. And Jerusalem would be over here, roundabout. Hebron, they're looking downward. And kind of towards the bottom of the Dead Sea is most likely where Sodom and Gomorrah are. And actually, the conditions of this of Sodom and of the Dead Sea rather is almost certainly the result of the judgment God brought upon Sodom and Gomorrah. That it's the lowest point on earth. This Dead Sea is, and it's the picture of God's judgment on earth as this. And in fact, it's so much so that in Ezekiel, during the kingdom, it says that rivers are going to flow out from the temple to the sea, the Dead Sea, and make the Dead Sea to be fresh water again. And fishermen will fish in the Dead Sea to prove it, that there will be living organisms there again. And so it is a total reversal of God's judgment. So that place there is where they're looking down upon. Now, it says Abraham went with them to set them on their way. So they've had this lavish meal, and they're going to leave. And then it says there's this kind of inner deliberation that Yahweh has, seems like with himself. But for our benefit, Yahweh said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him." What chapter does that take you back to? Pop quiz. Where does that language come from? What's that? Genesis 12. Yeah, Genesis 12, when the first time we see these promises given to Abraham. Genesis 12, 1-3. That's just a passage that we're going to get lots of mileage out of. We're constantly come back to Genesis 12, 1-3. And so many, it's a sticky verse, if you will. It's like everything sticks to it. It just keeps coming back up in Scripture. So he's kind of deliberating here. Should I bring Abraham into what I'm about to do, namely what he's about to do with Sodom and Gomorrah? And he references the logic that he is in covenant with him, that he's this covenant man, and therefore he should bring him into the secret counsels of God. Verse 19, "For I have chosen him." Literally, that word chosen is I've known him. I've known him. And that's actually helpful for us, just, not to get off on too many rabbit trails, but when you think about God's choice of us, even, it is very closely related to God's knowledge of us. And so then you get into the New Testament and we are foreknown by him, right? And that's the idea of God setting his love upon us, his knowledge of us, his intimate knowledge of us, and therefore he chooses us. So these two ideas of God's knowledge and his choice of us are very intricately connected. And so you can say one or you can say the other. In fact, in my ESV, it says chosen, but then there's a footnote, and the bottom of the page says known. So both can work there. So he's known him. He has this intimate relationship with Abraham by virtue of the covenant with him. And then he says, "For I've chosen him that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of Yahweh by doing righteousness and justice, so that Yahweh may bring to Abraham what he has promised him." So here you have his intentions for Abraham. He wants Abraham as well to pass on the knowledge of the true God and to his generations, and notice the language of righteousness and justice already popping up is a key theme in this chapter, that he's to pass on that knowledge of keeping the way of Yahweh. And so he's going to include Abraham in his plan here. This is why, because he's in covenant with him, because of the special role that Abraham has in the world. Yeah, he's going to disclose things to him. And in this way, Abraham functions a little bit like a prophet, because in Amos, it tells us that God doesn't do anything without revealing his plans to his prophets. Amos 3, verse 7. "For the Lord Yahweh does nothing without revealing his secrets to his servants, the prophets." So he's about to do this big thing, and he is going to reveal it to Abraham, a key figure. And also you think of how God does this as well. Jesus does this in John 16, verses 13-14 with his disciples. Says, "When the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all the truth, for he will not speak on his own authority, but whatever he hears, he will speak, and he will declare it to to you the things that are to come. He will glorify me, for he will take what is mine and declare it to you. All that the Father has is mine. Therefore I said that he will take what is mine and declare it to you. So even the apostles have this special role of having God's truth disclosed to them, even things related to the future. And most likely in context, he's speaking about the revelation of what's going to become the Gospels, what's going to become the epistles, and what's going to become the book of Revelation. So here he's giving Abraham this special disclosure of his word. He's giving him more information about his plans. And then notice what specifically in verse 20. Then Yahweh said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave. I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know. This outcry language reminds us of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4:10. This outcry of Cain's blood. And he's come down to see. Now, why this language of coming down? Does God need to come down? No, God knows. Why put it this way? We've seen God describe his actions in similar ways already in Genesis. Why does God speak this way? What is he trying to, what is the truth he's trying to communicate? You could put it that way, by speaking this way. Verse 21. He's everywhere? Yeah. He knows everything, yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And specifically, he's coming down to which city here? Sodom. Yeah. So if he's coming down to Sodom and he's considering, if we put it that way, even God knows what he's going to do, but for the sake of Abraham, what does that tell Abraham? That God is coming down to judge, to judge Sodom and Gomorrah, but what's that? He's sending his son Jesus down as an angel, like he came to him. Abraham, he came to him that way. Oh, he came to Abraham and revealed the promise. Yeah. It's what? I said that's really going wild. No. I think for God to speak this way, it's like he's gathering intel. Right? It's like this is discovery period, in like court cases, where they gather their information before they go to trial. Or this is like sending in recon, to make sure we drop the bombs on the right spot. It's a way to speak, to say to Abraham in a accommodating kind of way that God is going to investigate to be absolutely certain that this judgment is deserved. I mean, God already knows. He knows everything about this city. And God doesn't need to come down to investigate, but he often accommodates himself. And we call this, we actually saw this all the way back in Genesis 6. We spent a good deal of time talking about even God, the way God's God's emotions are spoken of, but here it's just God coming down in a physical way. We call it an anthropomorphism. It's God being portrayed as a man. What's something a man would do, and what? So then you have to ask the question: well, what does this communicate? If a man does this, what does that communicate? And so, if someone goes into a city that they're considering bringing judgment upon, and they go to investigate in that city, he's really telling him, "I'm going into the city to gather intel, to be absolutely certain that they deserve justice and judgment." And so it's an assurance that everything is above board. Everything is above board. God isn't doing anything unjust in this circumstance. And he's showing that to Abraham. So now, why does he tell Abraham all of this? Knowing what's going to come in the rest of the chapter, why does he reveal this to him? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So he gives him revelation of his purpose. It helps him to understand what God is doing. I mean, this is a city very close to him, and his nephew Lot is there. Mercy, yeah, to yeah, 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 absolutely. So he's bringing him in, and so what does Abraham do in response to this? He intercedes, yeah. So it's like God is he's bringing him in to. It's like he's luring him into prayer, if you will, by giving him this information. It's like he just leaves it out there, and Abraham is just compelled to pray. Then it's like he's being enticed, or he's being solicited to pray based on this information. And that's a common thing. God will give his revelation, and it's intended to bring his servants into prayer as a result of that. Now, does God need our prayers? Does God to do his plan? No, he doesn't. But he has chosen to incorporate our prayers into his grand plan, which is just an amazing thought. And so far be it from us to say, well, it doesn't matter if I pray, God's going to do what he's going to do. That's actually not an accurate view of how Scripture portrays our interaction with God in prayer. Because here he's bringing Abraham along. In fact, if you look at a parallel in Exodus 32, when Moses is praying that God would not destroy Israel, he reveals his plans about what he's considering doing, destroying Israel, and then it leads Moses to intercede for them and pray, and then God relents. Now, does God actually change? No, God doesn't change, but he is moving Moses and here moving Abraham to pray, and he incorporates their prayers then into his plans. And not only that, but it's a gracious way of him revealing himself and giving Abraham a deeper understanding of just how righteous he is. It's like he's plumbing the depths of God's righteousness. How righteous are you, God? And just fathoming down farther to see just how righteous God is. And so he's inciting him to pray in this way. I heard a funny illustration from one of the commentators I like, and he said, this is like a wife, saying to her husband, honey, I'm going to go, I think I'm going to go shopping at Dillard's and for the afternoon. And he says, that's not just a statement. He's like, this is soliciting, oh, honey, we don't have the money to do that. Or it's, oh, that's great. Yeah, you do need some new clothes. He's like, she wants some affirmation here. She wants she's letting this information out. Or another guy I was listening to on this passage, he was saying, his wife said, honey, come into my closet for a minute. And he said, we have two different closets. He's like, I don't think I've been in her closet for like a few years. And I came in and it was like a bomb had gone off and there was all this stuff everywhere. And he's like, honey, we have to do something about this. And he's like, and then we're into this big project of putting in shelves and all these things and this renovation project on her closet. And then he steps back and goes, I realized, I think I know what she was doing, come in here for a second and just help me clean out my closet a little bit. He's like, that wasn't all she was doing. It's like, look what she got out of all this. And it's like, that's what God is doing here with Abraham and welcoming into this prayer. He's saying, look what I'm about to do. And then Abraham is drawn into this prayer. And so this is the privilege invitation to prayer. The privilege invitation to prayer. He's put the bait on the hook right in front of Abraham, and he knows he will bite. Now, if that's the privilege invitation of prayer, then we see in verses 22 to 26 the primary interest in prayer. The primary interest in prayer. And here he goes to prayer. And we see some motion now of these angels in verse 22. So the men turned from there and went towards Sodom. But Abraham stood still before Yahweh. Then Abraham drew near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? So this language of drawing near is a great way to describe prayer. The author of Hebrews does the same thing. He uses same language of similar language of drawing near. Drawing near to the Lord, verse 22 of chapter 10. Let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith. Their hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. So We draw near to God. We approach God. And that's what Abraham does here. Now, what does his prayer assume? Just from the start, as we make some observations, what does his prayer assume about Sodom and Gomorrah? And the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. What's that? That they are wicked, yeah. So there is an assumption there that there is necessary judgment that needs to happen. What other assumptions does he have? I heard it. Someone's whispering it. Sounded right. I didn't hear it clear enough, though. Exactly, that there may be some righteous, though. And so he doesn't know for certain, but his concern is notice where his concern is. It's actually, his concern is not God save this whole city, but it's God protect those who are yours. It's like if there are righteous people here, and what is righteous? Well, we've learned about righteousness in chapter 15. Abraham believed Yahweh, and it was credited to him as righteousness, it was counted to him as righteousness. So this is not someone just being, right in their own efforts, but someone who has looked away from themselves to God and found righteousness from him. And so Abraham is in that status. And so he would say, Lord, if there are any of your people there, then will you just destroy them along with the city and treat them will you treat the righteous, those you've declared righteous, the same way that you'll treat the wicked? God, that seems to be unjust. And so that's his concern here, sweeping away the righteous with the wicked. And he assumes as well some things about the character of God, right? He assumes what about God's character? I think, yeah, exactly, that he's merciful, and the really explicit thing in the text, that he's just. Yeah, that he's just. So both of those things. So to plead on behalf of the city assumes that God is a merciful God and may hear. But also to appeal to God's righteous character assumes he's righteous. He's not questioning that in the sense it isn't a question, but I don't think he's skeptical as to God's character. In verse 24, he says, suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Why does he start at 50? We don't know, but he does. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. So there's the issue, that the righteous would be treated in the same way as the wicked would be. Far be that from you. And then he asks the question, shall not or will not the judge of all the earth do what is just? He knows God is the judge of all. I mean, it sounds like Paul in Acts chapter 17, that God has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he's appointed by raising him from the dead. So God is the judge of all the earth, and he will do what is just, what is right. And then he says, and Yahweh said, if I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake. That's incredible. So what he's not saying is, well, what he is saying is, even if there are a minority of righteous people, 50, I will spare the city. I will delay my judgment. And that's incredible. That's incredible. But here, what I want us to see is the primary interest in the prayer of Abraham, and it is the character of God. Right? It's just he's a pleading based upon who God is, who God has revealed himself to be. It is for the glory of God. It is the character, the perfections of God. He's very God-centered in his prayer. He's concerned that violence may be done to the character of God. And this is a good lesson for us, that a good basis or anchor point for our prayers is the perfections of God, that we start with who God is, we remind ourselves of who God is, and then even as we plead for certain things, we even if we could put it this way, remind God of who he is, right? We're really reminding ourselves of who God is. And so he doesn't think that God shouldn't judge the city, but that if there are righteous people there, then he should spare it. Now, what Abraham doesn't quite realize is there are no righteous people there. I mean, save his nephew Lot. And we even look at Lot, and in the next chapter, we're like, Lot? Righteous Lot? Second Peter 2, righteous Lot? What? But there is really no reason God should spare the city, but yet he does, and uh, he and it just shocks us too that Lot would be considered righteous based upon his actions, but it's not because of his actions, but because of where he looks for righteousness outside of himself. And so his intercession is going to demonstrate just how righteous God is. And we're so used to the God of the Bible in a way that we go, yeah, of course God is righteous. But for Abraham in this time, and this is like this God of his is remarkable. I mean, the other gods are like a soap opera. They're like crazy. There's no consistency. There's no consistent, unchanging, righteous standard. They are just as changeable and mutable as humans are. This and that, and just constantly changing their minds based upon their whims. But here's a God who is stable. Here's a God who doesn't change. And that is a pillow for Abraham and for us to rest our heads upon. That God is righteous. He's always righteous. He's always just. I mean, think about our study in First Peter. We're thinking about unjust suffering. And how we are to look to God, not take vengeance ourselves, but to look to God who judges justly. And so there's a pillow for our heads to go, all right, God is going to deal rightly with this. A story I came across that a number of commentators, preachers used in their commenting on this passage, and so it's a good one. And it's about an author who would often visit this man in his apartment, and he would say, "How's it going?" And he would pull out his tuning fork and hit it, and then he would say, "This is middle C," and he would and talk about how the neighbor's piano was out of tune, and that neighbor's was out of tune in this way. He says, "But middle C is always middle C. It was middle C yesterday. It'll be middle C tomorrow." And that was always what he said. "How's it going?" "Middle C is still middle C." And that was like his point where he was anchored. He could always be rest assured there. And it's like when we think about God's righteousness, it's like, how's it going? God is righteous. Society changes over here, society changes over there, but God, he's righteous. He's righteous. And you think about our culture and how there's almost like a revisionist history. Such that 15 years ago you have things that began to become normalized, that now for the next generation it's like, well, it's always been like that. And the narrative is like, oh yeah, it's always been like this in history. In fact, it's like, no, not at all. I mean, we understand that human heart has always been depraved, but as far as like cultural acceptance of certain things, I mean, it's Pride Month after all. And just in God's providence, what are we doing for Pride Month? We're studying Genesis 18 and 19 in God's providence. And so, go figure. God has us here condemning the very things that are being celebrated. But there you go. But you see just this revisionist view of things, and it's like we're made to think like we're crazy, for not getting on the same bandwagon as everyone else. But here's a great pillow for our heads. No, God's standard is always the same. It's always the same. And the standard, yes, it condemns us outside of Christ, and it draws us back to Christ as well. But the standard is the same, this righteous standard. It never changes. Listen to a few other passages. Job 34, verse 10. "Therefore, hear me, you men of understanding. Far be it from God that he should do wickedness, and from the Almighty that he should do wrong. Far be it." Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 4. the rock. His work is perfect, for all his ways are justice, a God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. Psalm 97, verse 2. It says, clouds and thick darkness are all round him. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. And just before that, in verse 1, it says, Yahweh reigns, let the earth rejoice, let the many coastlands be glad. And the passage ends in verse 12, rejoice in Yahweh, O you righteous, and give thanks to his holy name. So it's bracketed with this call to rejoice. So righteousness is something we ought to rejoice in. It's like, wow, God, you're righteous. Oh, it's so good. What a balance for us. What a ballast. God is righteous. It's the foundation of his throne from which he rules. And so our prayers, we might say, are best when they're based upon the character of God. In a way, we might say that Abraham's prayers are generated by God's revelation, and they are grounded in the revelation of God, right? So he reveals something to him. He reveals his word about what he's going to do, and that motivates him. It draws him in. It lures him, and it solicits him to pray, just like it does with us. You read the scriptures, and you're like, man, I need to pray. This is something I need to just praise God for, or confess, or ask God for, or for that person, or me, or whatever, to give thanks for. And it brings us in to pray. And then also our prayers are grounded in the revelation of God to us in his word. And so not only is he brought to pray by God's revelation, but what he then prays is based upon God's revelation of himself and of his character. And so just great truth here about God's righteousness being revealed to him, but also about our intercession. Any thoughts just thus far in the passage? Just you think about our culture, you think about righteousness and God's character and what's being revealed here and the comfort this brings. I'll take a sip of water while you think.
Robert, I think I totally agree with you, but I'm not, in my estimation, I think that kind of what's revealed here in more of a overarching way is that God chooses. You talked about that, this foreknowledge of Abraham. He reveals himself, and in that revelation, because who do we know Abraham is? He's the father of faith.
Yeah.
So when God reveals himself, Abraham and God imparts faith to him, helps him, causes him to believe in him. The prayer is a result of the faith.
Yeah.
And the more God reveals, the greater faith Abraham gains. It's interesting, and we'll see this later, but he has to do the same thing to Isaac, and then particularly to Jacob.
Yeah.
Jacob has some faith because he sees his dad. It's kind of like, yeah, I kind of know who Yahweh is, but he has to go through the same process.
Yeah.
And so I just, it's just a small thing, but categorically, I think, this is evidence of Abraham's faith in God. And because of the faith, he prays.
Yeah.
And I also think that practically what Abraham is concerned about is Lot.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Materially, in that moment, at that time, he, I hope, obviously, we can't know that for sure, but even to the narrowing down, well, see how many people in Lot's family?
Yeah, right.
To go here.
Yeah.
And can I at least, get God to not destroy that awful place down there for the sake of Lot?
Yeah.
But he, all the while, he knows that Yahweh is God and has that power and that ability, and that he is just, like you're pointing out. It's just very clear. And God is accommodating to himself to Abraham and therefore to us, and playing out this drama because he wants us to know him, and he wants to. I think wasn't it Piper that wrote the book, The Justification of God? Oh
yeah.
Where God is just like,
Romans 9.
Not only am I just, I'm going to show you mere mortals how just I am.
Yeah.
So it's this drama playing out.
Yeah.
Increase Abraham's faith, cause him to turn to God and pray and intercede, and then obviously us as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so absolutely prayer, but I think prayer is a result of faith.
Mm-hmm. No, I like the sharpening of the tip there, and just thinking about that, because Well, two things. One, yeah, Lot is a concern because when was the last time Abraham had interactions with Sodom? Well, it was to save Lot, right? Those kings, that battle that happened, and those kings swept down, and so he takes his men and he fights and he interacts with the king of Sodom after that because he's delivered the king of Sodom. So already Abraham has a physical deliverance of Sodom, and it's on for the benefit motivated by Lot. And here now God is saying, I'm going to judge the city in a different way. And he's praying then, and of course, yeah, he has family in the city. um the other thing it makes me think of when you say that is, I mean, just God does this time and again with Job. He brings Job through this, and at the end Job says, I had heard of you with the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes have seen. And so Job comes out the other end knowing God better. He doesn't know all the reasons for why God brought the suffering, but he knows God better. And then you think of Lazarus, the death of Lazarus and Mary and Martha, and you have that story, and it says he delayed because he loved them. And you're like, that doesn't make any sense. And yet at the end, chapter 12, you have was it Mary who, yeah, Mary brings this expensive ointment and anoints Jesus' feet. It's this incredible, lavish act of worship. But what just happened in her life? Her brother died, and Jesus allowed it, and then he raised him so that they would have, through that sorrow, a greater appreciation of God's character and goodness and love for them. And now worship is on the other end. So it's always worship on the other end. It's like revelation, growing faith, and then deeper worship. So I like that, just to point out, yeah, that this faith that God is bringing him along, and he's going to do that with the other patriarchs as well in Israel. Yeah.
You mentioned that Job would just wept to have Romans, he would have wept to have Genesis.
Yeah, right?
To see how God reacts with Abraham.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Seems to me there's another option God didn't choose. He could have told Abraham, okay, if there's 5 down there, I'll kill everybody but them. Destroy everybody but the 5.
Yeah.
That wasn't brought up in their conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he does do that.
But he's still been righteous. Right?
Yeah. So you have, what's interesting, people ask, and this is the last point, I just call this last point in the final verses, the profound insights from prayer, verses 27 to 33. And we've read it, but you just see the narrowing. And I was just reading it again this morning, and he starts from, 50 to 45 to 40. And then he starts dropping instead by 5s to 10s, right? 30, 20, 10. It's like, let's kind of, okay, this isn't working. Let's extend the numbers here, make them bigger chunks. Yeah. Yeah. It'd be one thing if he kept with the decreasing by 5s, but he starts by decreasing by 5s and then increases it to 10s. And people go, why does he stop at 10? Why didn't he go further? And we're not actually told why that is, but it may simply be that the point has been established. It's like, okay, God has made his point clear, and I'm going to leave it at that. And just asking further is not going to be beneficial. God has established his point that he is absolutely righteous. And so, yeah, it is fascinating to think. I mean, but notice just a few things on the surface here. You see Abram's humility as he prays. Verse 27, I am but dust and ashes. You see his persistence in prayer. I mean, he just keeps asking. You see his boldness in prayer to just keep asking this same thing and bringing this up. Here's an interesting note of contrast. Think about the difference between Abraham and Jonah. Abraham, he's here pleading on behalf, wanting to see the city delivered. Jonah, pops his tent up and looks down at the city of Nineveh, and he's like, all right, see if he's going to destroy him. Gets his lemonade, and it's like, yeah, popcorn. It's like, all right, let's see the fireworks, God. And he's upset. He's angry enough to die when God delivers the city. This is a wicked city, God. You have to judge this. How can you show mercy? And there's the flip-flop of it, where they deserve God's judgment, and yet he's merciful to an entire generation of Ninevites. Now, Nahum, a few generations later, he judges them and wipes them out. But here's just a diamond in the rough that God has chosen to redeem this one generation of Ninevites for his good pleasure. And Jonah is just so cut up, eaten up about it. Whereas Abraham here is really pleading for these people who are very wicked and deserve judgment. But, oh God, would you just spare them if it would only be for just the minority of righteous people in the city? So very, very fascinating contrast there. We're out of time. So let me just, I like this observation by Dale Ralph Davis. He says this: Abraham is exploring, feeling his way to see how far mercy might go, even in the service of justice. In light of the whole Sodom story, this countdown process underscores Yahweh's justice in destroying Sodom. He would spare it for 10 righteous. Yet he did destroy it, since 10 such were not found. But the principle operating in and with and behind Abraham's intercession seems to be that the presence of God's people benefits the wicked in this age, for the presence of the righteous may hold off or postpone judgment on the wicked. So just a good reminder for us. We have no idea what kind of influence we might even be having in our prayers or our presence in our generation. No doubt we can think of the wickedness that is mirrored in our culture as well. And I heard Steve Lawson say, if God doesn't judge America, he has to raise Sodom from the dead and apologize. It's like, yikes. But here I think you do see something of an implication that there are righteous people that God would spare a wicked city on behalf of. Our culture thinks of it totally different. If there's a group of people who have done injustice, the culture wants to apply that to everyone in the culture. The whole thing's bad. Everyone's guilty of this. Whereas the opposite is true here. There's just a few who are righteous and among a wicked culture, and it's like God's going to spare them. And maybe not for how God will act in every case. Certainly not. We see, but here in this instance, he's willing to do that. So God's righteousness. God is right. He will do what is right. Let me pray. Father, thank you for this opportunity to peer into your word again and just to see the growing of Abraham's faith, as was pointed out, and how you reveal yourself to draw us in, to teach us, even in prayer and even in your revelation of yourself, that we might know your character better and enjoy you and see who you are and marvel at who you are. Help us to do the same, Lord, as Abraham and grow in our knowledge of you. And Lord, we do pray for the wicked culture around us, that you would show yourself righteous and yet merciful at the same time, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.